Historical records from the 13th century describe the rapid territorial expansion of the Mongol Empire as not only a military phenomenon, but also a system of social and demographic restructuring. As Mongol forces moved across Central Asia, Persia, Eastern Europe, and into parts of the Middle East, their campaigns produced large populations of displaced people. Among them were women taken during raids, sieges, and post-conflict consolidations. Individuals who would become integrated into Mongol-controlled societies under conditions that were rarely recorded in their own voices. Contemporary Persian and Chinese chroniclers, including those writing under Mongol administration, noted that the capture and redistribution of populations was not incidental. It formed part of a broader imperial strategy. Labor, craft knowledge, and reproductive capacity were all considered valuable resources. Women, in particular, were categorized within systems of allocation that reflected both military hierarchy and the priorities of elite households. Surviving documents suggest that after major conquests, captives were sorted according to age, skills, and perceived utility. Artisans might be relocated to administrative centers, while others were distributed among soldiers and commanders. Women of childbearing age were frequently assigned to households, either as servants, concubines, or in some cases secondary wives. The distinctions between these roles were not always rigid, but they were structured by legal and customary frameworks that varied across regions. The Mongol imperial system itself did not rely on a single uniform code for governing such practices. Instead, it combined steppe traditions with administrative systems inherited from conquered societies. The Yasa, often described as a body of Mongol customary law, is referenced in several sources, although its exact content remains debated among historians. What can be established is that the distribution of captives was regulated, and that elite control over such processes reinforced loyalty within the ranks. Chroniclers noted that high-ranking officers and members of the ruling had priority in selecting captives. Women taken from noble or urban backgrounds were sometimes incorporated into elite households, where their roles could include managing domestic affairs or serving as intermediaries between different cultural groups. In these contexts, their treatment depended heavily on their perceived status and the political utility they represented. However, for the majority of captured women, conditions were shaped by more immediate forms of control. Accounts from regions such as Khwarezm and northern China describe forced marches following sieges, during which captives were relocated over long distances. Mortality rates during these movements were high, particularly among those unable to endure the pace or conditions imposed by military logistics. Once integrated into Mongol-controlled territories, these women entered a social structure that differed significantly from many of the societies from which they had been taken. Mongol pastoral life was mobile, with encampments organized around kinship units and seasonal migration patterns. Women within Mongol society traditionally held responsibilities related to household management, including the maintenance of yurts, food preparation, and the oversight of livestock-related tasks. Captured women were often expected to adapt to these roles, regardless of their previous social standing. Legal codes of the period reveal that Mongol women, particularly those within the ruling lineage, could exercise a degree of authority uncommon in many contemporary sedentary societies. They could manage property, influence political decisions, and act as regents. However, this relative autonomy did not extend equally to all women within the empire. Captured individuals occupied a different position, one defined by their lack of kinship ties and their status as dependents within households. Persian administrative texts from the Ilkhanate period indicate that enslaved or semi-enslaved individuals could, under certain conditions, be integrated into the social fabric over time. Children born to Mongol fathers and captive women were generally recognized within the paternal lineage, which had implications for inheritance and status. This process contributed to the gradual diversification of the empire's population, blending steppe traditions with the cultures of conquered regions. At the same time, these systems of incorporation were not neutral. They were mechanisms through which power was maintained and extended. By redistributing women among soldiers and elites, the Mongol reinforced bonds of loyalty and rewarded participation in campaigns. The practice also functioned as a means of demographic control, ensuring that conquered populations were fragmented and less capable of organized resistance. Contemporary accounts from European envoys, such as those sent by the papacy, provide additional observations. These envoys described Mongol camps where individuals from multiple regions coexisted under hierarchical arrangements. They noted the presence of women who spoke different languages and practiced different customs, indicating the extent of population movement resulting from Mongol expansion. However, these external accounts must be approached with caution. They were often written with specific political or religious, and their descriptions could be influenced by unfamiliarity with steppe societies. Even so, when cross-referenced with Persian and Chinese sources, a consistent pattern emerges. The systematic capture and redistribution of women was a recognized aspect of Mongol imperial practice. The lived realities of these women remain difficult to reconstruct in detail. The historical record is largely silent on their individual experiences, focusing instead on administrative categories and elite perspectives. What can be inferred is that their lives were shaped by a combination of coercion, adaptation, and negotiation within constrained circumstances. Some evidence suggests that over time, certain individuals were able to achieve more stable positions within households. This could occur through childbirth, demonstrated competence in domestic management, or the favor of a household head. In such cases, their status might shift from that of a transient captive to a more established, though still subordinate, member of the community. Yet, this possibility of integration did not negate the conditions under which they had been brought into the system. The initial act of capture, often accompanied by violence and displacement, set the terms of their incorporation. The absence of kinship networks and the dependence on their assigned households limited their autonomy and exposed them to varying degrees of vulnerability. Legal and administrative texts from the Yuan dynasty in China indicate that the Mongol continued to rely on categorized populations, including those designated as household dependents or servants. These classifications affected taxation, labor obligations, and legal protections. Captured women and their descendants were often placed within these categories, shaping their social position across generations. The broader impact of these practices can be observed in the demographic and cultural transformations of the regions under Mongol control. The movement of populations facilitated the exchange of skills, technologies, and cultural practices. At the same time, it disrupted existing social structures and contributed to the reorganization of communities along lines defined by imperial authority. Chroniclers writing in the aftermath of Mongol conquests frequently emphasized the scale of destruction and displacement. While these accounts vary in tone and emphasis, they collectively point to a period in which large numbers were uprooted and reassigned within a rapidly expanding imperial framework. Women taken during these campaigns were part of this process, their lives intersecting with the economic imperatives of the empire. In examining these historical patterns, it becomes clear that the experiences of captured women cannot be understood in isolation. They were embedded within systems of governance that prioritized control, mobility, and the redistribution of human resources. Their roles, though often obscured in the historical record, were integral to the functioning of Mongol society as it extended across continents. Surviving evidence, though limited, allows for a reconstruction of these dynamics at a structural level. It reveals an empire that managed populations with a degree that contemporaries both observed and at times struggled to comprehend. Within this framework, the category of the captured bride reflects not a singular experience, but a range of conditions shaped by hierarchy, policy, and the contingencies of conquest. The consequences of these systems extended beyond the immediate period of Mongol dominance. In many regions, the legacies of population movement and restructuring persisted, influencing patterns of settlement, identity, and for generations. The presence of mixed communities, of cultural practices, and of certain administrative categories all point to the term of Mongol imperial strategies. As the empire stabilized and transitioned into regional khanates, these practices evolved, adapting to local conditions and administrative needs. However, the underlying principle, that human populations could be reorganized to serve imperial, remained a defining feature of Mongol rule. As Mongol rule transitioned from rapid conquest to sustained governance, the administrative treatment of captive populations became more structured, though not necessarily more humane. Surviving documents from the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Yuan administration in China indicate that categories of dependency were formalized, often recorded in tax registers and household rolls. Women taken during earlier campaigns, along with their children, were increasingly absorbed into these classifications, where their identities were defined less by origin and more by function within the imperial system. In Persian fiscal records, chroniclers noted distinctions between free households, military retainers, and dependent laborers. Women assigned to elite households were typically counted among the latter, though their exact designation could vary depending on their role. Some were registered as domestic servants, others as members of extended units under the authority of a male head. These classifications determined not only their labor obligations, but also their legal standing in disputes, inheritance matters, and interactions with state authorities. Legal codes of the period reveal that Mongol governance often prioritized order and predictability over uniformity. In regions with established bureaucratic traditions, such as northern China, administrators adapted existing systems to incorporate Mongol hierarchies. Household registration became a key instrument of control. Captured women and their descendants were recorded within these systems, effectively binding them to specific locations and obligations. This reduced mobility and limited opportunities for escape or reintegration into their communities of origin. Chinese sources from the Yuan period describe the existence of state-managed labor groups, where individuals of diverse backgrounds were organized according to skill and utility. While much of this documentation focuses on artisans and agricultural workers, references to household dependents indicate that women were included within these broader labor frameworks. Their work often remained domestic in nature, but it was nonetheless part of a larger economic system that sustained both elite households and state functions. Contemporary accounts suggest that adaptation to these roles was not merely a matter of survival, but also a process shaped by negotiation within constrained circumstances. Women who demonstrated proficiency in managing household resources or navigating linguistic and cultural differences could attain a degree of stability. In multilingual environments, such as the urban centers of the Ilkhanate, individuals capable of mediating between Persian, Turkic, and Mongolian speakers held practical value. This did not eliminate their subordinate status, but it could influence their treatment and the expectations placed upon them. Chroniclers noted that over time, the boundaries between captive and integrated populations became less distinct, particularly in second and third generations. Children born into Mongol households, regardless of maternal origin, were often socialized within the cultural norms of the ruling group. This process contributed to the gradual blending of identities across the empire, though it also obscured the origins of those whose ancestors had been taken during earlier conquests. However, surviving evidence also indicates that distinctions were maintained in certain contexts. Legal disputes recorded in Persian court documents occasionally reference lineage and origin, particularly when questions of inheritance arose. In such cases, the background of a mother could influence the claims of her children, especially in households where multiple wives or concubines were present. These disputes reveal that while integration was possible, it was neither complete nor free from hierarchical differentiation. The political dimension of these practices becomes more apparent when examining the role of elite women within the Mongol imperial structure. Women of the ruling lineage often exercised considerable authority, managing Ordo encampments and controlling significant resources. Historical records from both Persian and Chinese sources describe instances in which elite Mongol women acted as patrons, administrators, and even political makers. Their position within the hierarchy, however, was fundamentally different from that of captured women, whose authority, if any, was derived from their relationship to male household heads. This contrast underscores the layered nature of gender within the empire. While Mongol society afforded certain privileges to women of specific status, it simultaneously maintained systems of dependency that constrained others. Captured women existed within this dual framework, where gender alone did not determine one's position. Instead, status was shaped by a combination of origin, kinship, and proximity to power. European observers traveling through Mongol-controlled territories during the 13th and 14th centuries provided additional, though sometimes fragmented, insights. Envoys and merchants described encountering households that included from multiple regions, each performing distinct roles. These accounts often emphasize that imposed by Mongol authority, noting that even in diverse and mobile communities, social hierarchies were clearly delineated. One recurring observation in these sources is the relative absence of overt resistance among captive populations. This has been interpreted in various ways by historians. Some suggest that the overwhelming of Mongol campaigns, combined with the fragmentation of conquered societies, limited the for organized opposition. Others argue that the administrative systems put in place by the Mongols created conditions in which compliance was incentivized, whether through material stability or the avoidance of punishment. Legal documents from the Yuan dynasty indicate that severe penalties were imposed for attempts to flee assigned households or evade registration. These measures reinforced the boundaries of the system and discouraged movement outside prescribed roles. For women, whose mobility was already constrained by social expectations and household responsibilities, such restrictions further reduced the likelihood of escape. At the same time, it is important to recognize that the historical record is shaped by the perspectives of those who produced it. The voices of captured women themselves are largely absent, leaving historians to reconstruct their experiences indirectly. What emerges from this reconstruction is a pattern defined by adaptation within limits, where individual outcomes could vary but were always conditioned by the structures of imperial control. The integration of captive populations also had implications for the economic stability of Mongol. By redistributing labor and incorporating diverse skills into their domains, the Mongols were able to sustain both their mobile pastoral and the sedentary agricultural systems of conquered regions. Women assigned to households played a central role in maintaining these systems, managing daily tasks that supported broader economic. In some cases, evidence suggests that women brought from urban centers contributed knowledge of textile production, food preparation techniques, or other specialized domestic skills. These contributions, though rarely highlighted in official records, would have had practical effects on the functioning of households and, by extension, of the empire. Chroniclers writing in Persian during the Ilkhanate period occasionally allude to the presence of women from distant regions within elite circles. Their descriptions are brief and often filtered through elite concerns, but a degree of cultural exchange that accompanied the movement of people. Clothing styles, culinary practices, and linguistic expressions could reflect this, creating environments where multiple traditions coexisted, albeit within hierarchical constraints. The long-term consequences of these processes are visible in the demographic patterns of regions once Mongol control. Genetic and cultural indicate a blending of populations that corresponds with the historical record of large-scale movement and integration. While such evidence does not provide direct insight into individual experiences, it reinforces the changes initiated during this period. As Mongol political structures evolved, and in some regions, declined, the status of dependent populations also shifted. In the Ilkhanate, for example, the gradual adoption of Persian administrative norms and Islamic legal frameworks influenced the treatment of household dependents. Some individuals were able to transition into more recognized social categories, particularly as the rigid distinctions of the conquest period softened over time. However, these changes were uneven and often limited. The legacy of initial capture continued to shape the lives of many, particularly in rural areas where administrative oversight was consistent. In such contexts, local power dynamics could determine the conditions under which individuals lived, sometimes reinforcing older patterns of dependency. The broader imperial context also influenced these dynamics. As communication and control across vast territories became more challenging, regional authorities exercised greater autonomy. This decentralization affected how policies were implemented, including those with population management. While central directives might outline general principles, their application depended on local and the priorities of individual governors or military leaders. Despite these variations, the fundamental role of captured women within the Mongol system remained tied to their incorporation into households as units of labor and reproduction. Their presence supported the continuity of social structures that were essential to the functioning of the empire. At the same time, their experiences reflect the cost of a built-on conquest and surviving records, though limited, allow for an understanding of these dynamics that is both specific and broadly representative. They point to a world in which identities were reshaped by force, and where the boundaries between coercion and adaptation were constantly negotiated within the imperial authority. Over time, as the Mongol Empire fragmented into successor states, these inherited systems continued to influence local societies. The categories established during the period of expansion did not disappear immediately. Instead, they were modified, reinterpreted, and in some cases, preserved within new political contexts. The women who had once been taken as captives, and the generations that followed them, remained part of this evolving landscape, their lives embedded within the structures that had first defined them through displacement. By the late 13th and into the 14th century, the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into distinct khanates introduced regional variation into systems that had once been more uniformly directed by imperial priorities. Yet surviving documents suggest that earlier practices concerning the redistribution and integration of captured populations did not disappear abruptly. Instead, they became embedded within local administrative traditions, where they were adapted to new political and legal frameworks. In the territories of the Ilkhanate, historical records indicate a gradual alignment with Islamic legal institutions, particularly following the conversion of rulers such as Ghazan Khan. Legal scholars and administrators began to incorporate elements of Islamic jurisprudence into governance, including regulations concerning slavery, household dependency, and inheritance. Within this evolving framework, women who had been taken during earlier Mongol campaigns, along with their descendants, were increasingly categorized according to established legal definitions rather than purely step-based customs. Legal codes of the period reveal that enslaved individuals could, under certain conditions, obtain limited protections. These included recognition of familial relationships and, in some cases, pathways to manumission. However, surviving documents suggest that such outcomes were not the norm and often depended on the discretion of household authorities. For many women, their position remained tied to domestic service and reproductive roles within households that continued to function as primary units of economic and social organization. In Central Asia, particularly within the domains of the Chagatai Khanate, the persistence of steppe traditions combined with localized governance created a different set of conditions. Chroniclers noted that nomadic patterns remained influential, and with them, the continued importance of kinship structures. Captured women in these were often absorbed into extended units, where their status was mediated by relationships within the household rather than formal legal categorization alone. Chinese sources from the declining years of the Yuan dynasty indicate that administrative records continued to track dependent populations with precision. Household registration systems, which had been strengthened under Mongol rule, persisted as a means of taxation and labor allocation. Women identified as dependents or servants were recorded alongside other members of the household, their obligations defined in terms that linked them to state revenue and economic productivity. These bureaucratic practices had long-term implications. By formalizing the status of individuals within administrative systems, the Yuan authorities contributed to the stabilization of social hierarchies that had originated in earlier periods of conquest. For the descendants of captured women, this meant that their position was often inherited, shaped by classifications that could endure across generations. At the same time, historical evidence suggests that processes of cultural integration continued to unfold. Archaeological findings and textual analysis, the blending of material culture, including clothing, household, and dietary practices. These changes were not solely the result of elite exchange, but were also influenced by the interactions within households that included individuals from regions. Chroniclers writing in Persian and Chinese during this period occasionally remarked on the presence of individuals who embodied multiple cultural traditions. While such observations are limited, they provide indirect evidence of the ways in which populations once separated by conquest became interconnected through shared living environments. Women who had been taken as captives, and later their daughters and granddaughters, were part of this process, contributing to the transmission of skills and customs, even as their own origins became less visible in the historical record. Despite these forms of integration, systems of hierarchy remained firmly in place. Legal disputes preserved in court archives from the Ilkhanate reveal that questions of lineage and legitimacy continued to influence social standing. In households where multiple wives or concubines were present, the status of each woman could affect the rights of her children, particularly in matters of inheritance. These disputes highlight the distinctions rooted in origin, even as broader processes of assimilation were underway. The political utility of such systems also persisted. By maintaining clear hierarchies within households, ruling authorities reinforced that extended beyond the domestic sphere. Loyalty to household heads, and by extension to the state, was sustained through structures that linked personal relationships to broader networks of power. Women assigned to these households, regardless of their origin, were of these networks, their roles contributing to the stability of the system as a whole. European travelers of the 14th century, including merchants and envoys who passed through Mongol successor states, continued to note the diversity of populations within these regions.